The purpose of this presentation is to provide some notes and feedback from the Advanced English Marking Centre for Module A. The learning objective for this presentation is what are the HSC markers looking for in higher band responses? The first thing that's critical to responding well to a question is having a sound and deep understanding of the rubric itself. So not only does the rubric highlight the content and skills that you need to explore in the module and text, but the rubric and terminology shapes the question you will be asked in the exam. And this includes synonyms or links to key concepts, words, terminology in the rubric. So in order for us to continue and unpack the essay question, let's quickly refresh our memory and go over the Module A rubric again. I've highlighted the key words from the Module A rubric. In this module, students explore the ways in which the comparative study of text can reveal resonances and dissonances between and within texts. Students consider the ways that a reimagining or reframing of an aspect of a text might mirror, align, or collide with the details of another text. In their textual studies, they also explore common or disparate issues, values, assumptions, or perspectives, and how these are depicted. By comparing two texts, students understand how composers, so authors, poets, playwrights, directors, designers, and so on, are influenced by other texts, contexts, and values, and how this shapes meaning. Now, the first part of the rubric, as you would know, focuses more on the conceptual elements of this module, whereas the next part of the rubric focuses more on the analytical skills required throughout the module. Students identify, interpret, analyse, evaluate the textual features, conventions, context, values, and purpose of two prescribing texts. As students engage with the text, they consider how their understanding, appreciation, and enjoyment of both texts has been enhanced through the comparative study, and how the personal, social, cultural, and historical contextual knowledge that they bring to the texts influences their perspectives and shapes their own compositions. I've highlighted there because in the exam, marks are really rewarded to students who are creative in developing an argument and they have a confident and authoritative voice in their response. So I think it needs to be a personal response and direction for your essay. As mentioned earlier, it's important not only to have an understanding of the rubric, but to have an understanding of some of the synonyms or links to words and phrases and concepts in the rubric. So it's important to have this understanding because, yes, questions are shaped by the rubric, but also you need to have a number of words to use to reflect your understanding of the rubric throughout your essay. So for example, textual conversation. What other words or phrases could connect to this concept? We've got words like dialogue, dialogic, the hyper or the hypotext, intertextuality, relationship between texts. All of these words link in some way to this rubric term. Some general feedback from the Module A Marking Centre for Advanced English in 2020. Better responses demonstrated personal and thoughtful engagement with the whole question. And this needed to also be sustained throughout the response. Better responses framed responses around a clear, highly relevant personal thesis that provided scope to generate a considered, thoughtful discussion. Again, this idea of a personal response, a personal thesis. They also demonstrated a detailed understanding of context, including where composers may have criticised or rejected aspects of their own context. And of course, context really should have underpinned their essay's argument. Better responses were able to differentiate between social, historical and cultural contexts, show a deep and individual understanding of the text, and make effective use of appropriate references to the text, reveal a strong understanding of the connections between the texts. This is a fairly obvious one given the Textual Conversations unit of work. They were able to maintain a balanced and synthesized analysis of the text pairing. Really important to have symmetry in your analysis and make sure that you're not just talking about one text more than the other. They were able to unpack the concept of textual conversation, offer an extended and comprehensive analysis of text and context, use evaluative language in a confident and authoritative manner to consider their argument, and demonstrate a skillful command of language and structure. So let's have a look at the 2020 question. In textual conversations, the later text is often seen as a shadow, lacking the originality and power of the earlier. To what extent is this statement true of the two prescribed texts you have studied? What I've done here is I've highlighted the keywords in the question, remembering that those keywords link to elements or terminology in the rubric itself. So let's have a look at some of the rubric terms that these keywords relate to. Before we move on, I think it's important to address the to what extent question. What does to what extent actually mean? And a number of students struggle with this question because they feel that they should disagree or agree with the idea posed in the question. But essentially, an essay question that asks to what extent, it's usually asking you to explain how much you agree with the idea being posed. Sometimes students think that it's asking whether you outright agree or disagree with an idea. However, to disagree with the statement or idea posed in the question can often lead to a poor thesis and a less detailed response. So basically, you want to respond with a yes, I agree, but approach. Obviously, you're going to use different words to show that, but that is essentially what you need to be doing. So this table presents the words in the question and how these link to the rubric or synonyms of keywords in the rubric, and how they might link to aesthetics or context or critical theory. So essentially what the keywords in the question invite you to discuss or prompt you to discuss. So to what extent? This really invites you to have your own personal stance and discussion of the idea posed. So remembering that a personal response to the question was something that was rewarded in the marking centre. The next term, textual conversation, and we looked at this as an example of a rubric term, which there are many synonyms or other phrases that link to this term. So this is really, I guess, prompting you to explore this comparative study, explore the idea of intertextuality, this theory of hyper versus hypotext, the dialogic nature of this unit of work, and the dialogue between the texts. Later text, Well, this links to the appropriated text or the hypertext. Shadow. Now, this was an interesting word, and I thought that really it was open to a lot of interpretation. But students generally who interpreted this word as something with kind of negative connotations generally didn't quite pull it off well enough. Potentially students who ranked well in the state might have done this, but certainly I didn't come across any students who did this and got an A response. But it's an important word in the question because it certainly relates to the resonances or the fact that it's an appropriated text, if we just look at that word in quite a sort of literal way. Lacking originality. Again, this is linking to the fact that it's an appropriated text. There are resonances within this text or within these texts, and it does invite you to discuss the aesthetics. Lacking power. I think the most obvious connection to this term is the context, and there's scope to explore the cultural, social, historical, and personal context in your response. Earlier, this really refers to the appropriated text or the hypotext. So some of the feedback specific to the Camus-Daoud pairing. Better responses acknowledge the value of text pairing in the introduction. They provided a personal stance generated by a deep understanding of the Algerian context and their understanding of racism and the other in colonised countries. They provided insightful, explicit, integrated contextual analysis, which then provided a framework for a sustained response. So really context is what should be underpinning your response to this sort of question. Better responses were able to analyse each text from an ontological perspective, thus initiating a philosophical discussion stimulated by the contextual underpinnings of the Algerian War. Again, this idea of context really driving your essay, but of course, the ontological perspective being a common kind of thread throughout your essay. Link each composer's purpose to the historical context and the role of absurdist literature in literary canons. So this certainly reflects the importance of context again in relation to how these composers have constructed their texts and what the purpose is behind these texts as well. The list of areas for improvement was quite long, but I picked out some ones which I thought were particularly relevant based on the Marcus report and feedback from the internal Module A essays. So it's really important to adapt knowledge to suit the question as opposed to reproducing a generic thematic style response, which links to the next point, avoiding topping and tailing, where they respond to the question in the introduction and conclusion and use pre-learnt responses in the body. I can't stress enough how important it is to have an essay that responds to the question. Simply put, you need to be signposting keywords from the question or links or synonyms to those keywords throughout your essay. And it's not just about throwing those words in and pretending that you're on track. It's really about unpacking the essay question and creating a thesis which is sustained throughout your essay. It's important to build a discussion that is focused on the intertextual conversation of the pair of texts as opposed to the text in isolation. I mean, this is a pretty obvious one given that it is a unit which centers around this idea of textual conversation. So if you are discussing these texts without looking at the resonances and dissonances, then essentially you're not meeting the requirements of the module. Discussing texts in an evaluative and analytical way rather than a descriptive way. Again, we've seen a lack of analysis in some of the responses internally. It's very important to make sure that you're using the correct meta-language, that you're really dissecting these texts and being evaluative when you're exploring these concepts. Okay, so it's certainly not going to pay to be recounting events in both texts. You need to be evaluative. Considering and analysing how meaning is shaped at a whole text level, rather than dealing with text references in an isolated way at sentence, scene, stanza level. So, taking out a piece of evidence and not really considering its purpose in relation to the entire text, and even really in relation to the textual pairings, is not going to really offer an acceptable way of substantiating your point. In this question, and I'll reflect on this a little bit later, developing an integrated response was actually more powerful than talking about text separately. And we'll discuss that a little bit more later on. And as mentioned before, using meta-language appropriately really enhanced students' arguments, and also using it correctly. So being able to identify those devices and elements of form accurately was very important. So we move on to, well, what would be a good structure for this essay? Integrated versus parallel structure. And I think it's important to note that there really isn't a one formula fits all approach to structuring an essay. You really do need to consider the question. So an integrated paragraph response worked well for the 2020 question. However, the divided paragraph approach worked better with the 2019 question. What doesn't change, regardless of the question, is that you must discuss both texts with symmetry and balance. So in response to this essay question, your thesis would perhaps explore or address the following points, and remembering that in your thesis and your introduction, you really want to be signposting those keywords, or at least synonyms or links to those keywords from the question. So in your thesis, you would address the following points. Although Daoud's The Mousseau Investigation appropriates Camus' Stranger, it's not a mere copy or imitation devoid of its own creativity. Rather, the hypertext is highly purposeful in repositioning power. And it repositions this power through challenging colonial narratives. For example, the Mousseau reframes the narrative of an Algerian 21st century context. What I've done here is I've highlighted some of those keywords that link to the question and that also link to the rubric. So appropriates, imitation, devoid of its own creativity, links to this idea of lacking originality. And then, of course, we argue that, well, there is actually purpose in appropriating text, and that purpose is to reposition power. And so this idea of power is linked also to this idea of reframing and challenging the colonial narratives. What's important to do now is have a look at the essay questions that I have put in a document for you that links to this presentation. What you need to do is look at those questions, highlight the keywords, think about what rubric terms they link to, and also think about what those words are inviting you to explore. I hope this has been useful, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions about this presentation. Thank you.